Hello and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival of ideas that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? Today's session is all about wireless communication. We've got Anna joining us from Tello Consulting and Andrew from Larkhill Consulting. And they both focus on enhancing and harnessing digital connectivity for product and service innovation. Don't forget to join in the conversation with us. A really simple way of doing this is to post your questions and comments in the box below this session. Alternatively, you can use the hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter. Without further ado, I'm going to now hand over to Andrew, who will introduce himself and kick off the conversation. Later on, we'll hear from Anna, and then we'll come back for some Q&A. So please do use the opportunity while they're speaking to think up your questions. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to kick us off. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Sterling. As Emily introduced me, I've been working in the communications field for a number of years, starting off with BBC Research Department, looking at some cool aspects of broadcasting, through various technology developments in the communications field, and more recently working with major players, including Microsoft, on some of the exciting techniques for enabling connectivity to get to people who've had very little connectivity, if any, to date, including corners of Africa, Scotland, and many different parts of the world. So this session is concerned with communication and connectivity. Communication is an essential foundation of the sharing economy, enabling information to flow between those who have resources and those who would like to share access to them. So it's pretty fundamental. Digital communications, additionally, enables the sharing to be more efficient and to operate more easily within local areas. That's because users can now have access to the information they need when they need it much more rapidly than was possible with our previous communications technology, namely our telephones. So having access to digital communications is becoming essential to sustaining our quality of life and economic opportunities, particularly looking forward. And this now applies to both people, and we're used to having access to the internet, as you are at the moment, but also to things, because a number of devices are becoming more intelligent. We've got the ability to deploy sensors all around the place that can keep an eye on our environment, make sure that our air quality is good, look at our traffic flows, help us avoid congestion. But those devices, those things, those sensors have their own connectivity needs, and we have to factor those into the whole picture too. Now, sharing is actually at the core of the communication networks themselves. So as well as enabling sharing, communication itself makes use of sharing. Since the earliest developments in mass communication, it's been clear that it wouldn't be economically feasible to have dedicated connections for every single pair of users who want to talk to each other. So imagine having a telephone wire from yourself to every single friend that you would want to talk with. It clearly wouldn't work. So we've shared our lines. In the early days, that sharing might have been time-based. In other words, you can use the line now, but later on your neighbor might be using it, so you'll have to wait. Now we can use digital technology and put packets over our lines. We call them packets. It's little bundles of data, and my data and my neighbor's data can go in separate packets, and I'm not aware of his or her data. It just seems as if we have continuous connection. So the sharing economy is about making most use of an unused resource, cutting waste and enabling us to do more. And this section is focusing in on wireless connectivity and how we can make use of this strange stuff called spectrum, which is an essential enabler and supporter of wireless connectivity. I'm just going to flash up a slide at this point if I can remember how to do it. So bear with me. Yep, I hope you can see that. I've got a nice quote from the ITU Direct Secretary General, So the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, is the worldwide treaty organization to which all governments sign up, which enables us to get the best use out of this vital resource we call spectrum. If we don't coordinate it, then chaos can result, and we end up with an inability to communicate. So what the Secretary General said is today there's virtually no aspect of our lives which does not make use of radio frequency spectrum in some way. So that's what it is. It's a powerful concept. And in fact, what we're talking about is this wonderful thing called electromagnetic radiation. This is a type of propagation, wave propagation, which is very powerful. It enables energy to reach us from the sun, for example. Part of the range of what we call wavelengths, we can actually see this energy. This is in the form of visible light. So on the slide, we can actually see what we think of as a visible spectrum from red through to purple. But we'll actually go into the far wider range of wavelengths, including what we call the radio frequencies, which is where a lot of our communication happens. So we will come on to that. We'll work out how to get there. There we go. So the electromagnetic spectrum goes all the way from the very shortest wavelengths right up at cosmic rays and gamma rays and X-rays, which all have their very important uses, through ultraviolet, visible light. Then as we go down through the red, we pass into infrared, which we can't see, but has some interesting properties and some applications. For example, for monitoring vegetation on the planet from space, from satellites, we can use that. We use it for remote control sometimes as well. And then we pass down, as we get longer in wavelength, into radio waves. And radio waves is where our communications are all focused. And there are certain features. If we look at the picture, you can see that up at the high end, we have things like UMTS, which you might know better as 3G mobile telephony. We've got Wi-Fi, we've got LTE. Passing down, we've got TV in this area of spectrum we call UHF, or ultra high frequency. Going longer wavelengths, we've got FM radio, and then longer wavelengths still, we go down into medium wave radio and long wave radio, which have almost become extinct. They still exist, I think, but they're pretty noisy and not very nice to listen to. So we don't make much use of those for mass communications at this point. So spectrum is essentially the wide range of properties, if we look at the full range of wavelengths that this electromagnetic radiation can have. And it's pretty important where you are on that spectrum, because the longer the wavelengths, the better the propagation, although typically the less capacity you have. And the shorter the wavelengths, the shorter the propagation range, typically, and often more capacity you can have. With light, for example, it is possible to communicate with light, and you've probably all tried torches and similar things, but while the curvature of the Earth is one thing that gets in the way, light gets absorbed. And it's clear that you can communicate a long way with visible light because we can see the sun, which is some 90 odd million miles away. So it's clear that you can have long distance propagation through the vacuum that is space. But for our purposes on Earth, we find that using these lower radio frequencies enables us to have ranges up to hundreds or possibly even thousands of miles for some of the shortwave transmissions that amateur radios and others use. So that's the range of spectrum. Let me now switch back to being me again. Do that. Yes, back again. So some analogies of other waves and propagation. We've got the water analogy. If we drop a pebble into a pond, for example, we imagine ripples coming out of that. An acoustic analogy would be ships' foghorn, for example, a very loud source. And in radio terms, very loud sources could include TV transmitters. For example, the TV transmitter not far from here at Crystal Palace in South London has an output of 1 megawatt, which is quite enough to reach around 12 to 15 million households across the London area. So some tens of kilometers from its location. Indeed, it is powerful enough to disrupt other possible uses right the way through the top half of France. So it has some considerable influence. We have other sources in using the radio spectrum. One of them is microwave ovens, interestingly, which use 2.4 gigahertz, which is the same frequency as Wi-Fi. So if your microwave oven is leaky, it might disrupt your Wi-Fi a little bit. And incidentally, that is why Wi-Fi got the frequency it has, because when the regulator looked at spectrum available to offer, it thought or realized that offering the same frequency as microwave ovens use was not going to be popular with operators, and therefore it opened the spectrum up on a license exempt basis for the IT industry to have a go with. And we have Wi-Fi as a result of that. Similarly, Bluetooth arrived using the same band and has found very nice applications in personal equipment, ranging from headphones through to mobile handset communications with beacons, for example. So we talked about spectrum having a range of wavelengths, and depending on where they are, their value varies. So some spots reach very, very high values. We saw with the 3G auctions for mobile telephony back in the 2000s that operators were prepared to spend billions of pounds to get hold of these. And spectrum is a very interesting resource. It's a completely renewable resource. And as wireless technologies improve and their applications increase, its value, economic value, all the time. So it's very valuable, and it's managed by national governments who take part in international forums to help manage it. And the national governments award permissions to use that spectrum, access that spectrum, through mechanisms that we call licenses. And they can award licenses in a number of ways. We refer to beauty parades, for example, where they invite applicants to submit descriptions of what they would do with the spectrum if they were to be awarded a license. They also are more increasingly using auctions that depend on how much money you're prepared to put on the table to determine whether you get access to that spectrum or not. So some of those licenses typically involve some money to be some money to be spent to acquire them, and also some other conditions. They also typically provide some element of exclusivity, which means that you won't have so many competitors able to come in because you've got a license which uses up some of the spectrum. There may be other operators who can acquire licenses, but there won't be an infinite number. So if we look at spectrum in general, we're talking about transmissions through the air, in which case the government is awarding licenses. We could also talk about private spectrum. For example, if we deploy a cable or a pipe that we might call a waveguide, we can create our own private spectrum, which means essentially we are connecting, let's say, a signal source with a signal destination, one place to another. That's not the business of spectrum that we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is where you want to transmit in the open air and have someone somewhere else receive it. So that's the permission to do that comes through spectrum licenses, except that there is a way of getting access to spectrum license exempt. We talked about Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Both of those are examples of license exempt technology. And to get access in that way, you have to have equipment which complies with the relevant standard for the license exemption. And there are standards for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth that are generally not under the control of the end user. All you have to do is buy the Wi-Fi equipment or the Bluetooth. Okay, there's a spectrum. I had a question about spectrum. So what is spectrum? Well, spectrum is the range of wavelengths. So if we went back to that title slide with the colors, the different colors going from red through to blue, violet, spectrum is the span of those different wavelengths. And what's interesting is that we can split the light or the signal into different wavelengths and have different communication channels occupying different wavelengths. So the finer the grain we can split the spectrum into, the more communications capacity we can create. I hope that's a bit clearer, but we can always come back to that at the end if that's still a confusing point. Now, the whole point about this section is actually sharing a spectrum. So we've talked a bit about it, and hopefully that's clarifying what it is. But when we talk about licenses where operators are given exclusive access to certain parts of the spectrum, which are often quite valuable, there is still a fair amount of capacity left unused, however. So this is because very often the access permissions awarded by a regulator might cover the whole of a country or the whole of a region, whereas for an operator, the most profitable areas for them to put their networks are typically urban city areas where lots of people live and work. And that's where they're going to get the return on the investment much more quickly. So if you live in a very small rural, remote area, you may not have very much coverage, and there's not a big incentive for the owner of that license to do anything about it, and nor are you, someone who doesn't have a license, able to make use of that unused spectrum. That is until recently, with the introduction of dynamic spectrum access. We now have tools available that allow us to get access to unused spectrum. The regulator started this with TV band, where we have now what we call geolocation databases that allow you, if you've got a device that can report its position, the databases, which are validated by the regulator, can tell you which channels are available, which frequencies are available for you to use. And we're now seeing that applied to solving some of the holes in rural broadband connectivity with some very powerful results, which we'll come on to. I've been hogging the microphone rather a lot, and my colleague Anna from Telco Consulting, who's very experienced in the commercial aspects of spectrum and sharing, is bursting to come in and talk with you. So I'm going to hand over to her and let her give you a brief intro right now.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Coast of Telco Consulting, and we specialize in more commercial aspects within the communication sectors. Not only, but predominantly within the communication sector. As Andrew has already introduced me, I been asked to join this session to explain some of those principles, key principles that affect the use of spectrum, the way spectrum is being sold, used, and exchanged for commercial profit. So if I go back a while, actually quite a few years ago, many years ago, most of the network industry and the governments had to accept what I would call the broad principle of sharing. Those industries include rail, air transport, any sector that really connects people located in different places, whether it's a physical location or whether a connection or whether it's a digital connection. But there is a fundamental principle that we all have the right to share access to a particular asset. And that asset, in our case today, is spectrum. It's frequency that is being used. On a very broad level, one can think of spectrum as being a human asset. They're available from us all. And it's only through the international agreement that that asset is shared between different regions, between different countries, and between different regions within a particular country. Now, sharing itself always implies some form of commercial transaction. Sharing is hardly ever, except a few examples that Andrew has mentioned in terms of licensing exams, done on a first come, first served basis, on a totally free basis. So there is always there is invariably, perhaps I should say, a commercial transaction that takes place between the owner of the asset, e.g. spectrum, or a person, an agency that acts on behalf of the owner of spectrum, and the person who requires that asset. And that, until recently, within UK and most of the world, actually, not just Western one, that exchange has been done via an auction or beauty process, whereby the operators will pay a price, sometimes lower, sometimes higher. But those licenses were invariably issued on
I think we've lost Anna there briefly. I don't know.
Yeah, Anna seems to have frozen somewhat, but that's okay. I'm sure she'll come back to us in a few minutes' time. Andrew, would you like to pick up on anything that Anna was commenting on there, just while we wait for her to come back on?
I think what she's saying is the core of what drives companies to invest in using spectrum. The challenge we've had is that companies are not willing to invest in using spectrum in areas where connectivity has been very poor. Now, I do have some little video clips, brief video clips, which I'd like to show to illustrate some of the applications that we've got for sharing spectrum, and really to underline how that makes a difference to people. So I don't know if there's time to do that now. I'll take Emily's advice. Emily?
Yeah, Andrew, we can certainly try and look at the videos. If they don't work, then we can post them on the session. Oh, is Anna back?
Oh, Anna's gone to Avatar.
Anna's gone to Avatar land. So yeah, Andrew, why not? Let's see if it works. Let's give it a go.
Yeah, we'll do that now. Great.
That might have been Anna, but
I think it was. Sorry about that. I will now switch on to. Can you see my screen, Emily? Yeah.
If not yet, if you try and click the screen share button.
Okay. So there we go. Start screen share. That should work.
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. Sorry for the technical glitches there.
Absolutely fine.
I was talking about spectrum that sits unused that we can now get access to and share. And this is just to illustrate what the TV white spaces look like. These are patches of spectrum that's used for terrestrial TV broadcasting. And this was an illustration produced by Ofcom showing where one particular frequency in that band was used. channel 59. It's one of 32 or so that are left in the broadcasting application. And you can see from the spots on the picture on the map of the UK exactly where that channel is used for TV broadcasting, but basically in the other parts of the UK, that channel would be available for us to share, provided we use one of the validated databases, and companies Nominet and Fair Spectrum are the two providers that have been validated. I think we've got Anna.
Hi. Yes. Hello.
Anna's back with us. Hi, Anna. Sorry,
Hi,
Andrew just picked up there while you were gone. No problem at all.
Thank
no problem.
you. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost the connection.
That's absolutely fine.
Can you hear me properly?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yes, okay. Just,
Andrew? Are you happy to pick up where you left off? Then?
Yes, if I can just...
Please do, Anna,
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think the most, I think I stopped at the point when I was talking about the practical example of how one would share. And the one that I can offer here is if you think of how would you recover your costs, and if you're running a business, the large proportion of your costs will be what people refer to as overheads, and at the end of your financial year, you have to think about how you're going to price your products in future, or for next year, or what your pricing policy going to be. And the most common policy would be allocation based on your markup on your existing cost base. And of course, large proportion of the cost base has to be shared out among your different products and services. And that's effectively what happens in reality in most of the network industries. And the policy that governments and the regulators have, it's usually trying to make it on the most equitable basis. So most of the access issues to any network, and in particular to spectrum, if spectrum is used, then it will be done on some form of equitable basis. And of course, there are difficulties with that, because we don't necessarily know what are the priorities or governmental priorities, how they see the social economic development in the future. But I think we can rest assured that will drive their policy and the way they will allocate the spectrum. Another very, very quick example, just to mention, is currently Ofcom is consulting on a sharing proposal for 3.8 gigabytes spectrum, and are consulting on a proposal whereby spectrum would be shared on some form of primary and secondary basis. And of course, the priorities inherent in the definition of what the primary use would be extremely important at this point. I don't want to run over. I know I've lost some time because of the network problems, but I don't want to. I think at this point, I'd like to hand over to Emily.
Hi, thank you, Anna. Sorry that we lost you there. I think, as Andrew said earlier, it must have been your microwave interrupting your Wi-Fi connection, maybe.
Maybe.
That's absolutely fine. So we'll run into some Q&A now. So just a reminder to anyone that is watching online, please do post your comments and questions in the box below this session, or on Twitter using the hashtag ThinkDiff. So first question we've got is from a guy called Seb, and he would like to know if there's more to communications and wireless technologies than meets the eye. Who would like to kick this one off? Maybe Anna, would you like to kick this one off?
I think it's a very broad question. There is. I mean, obviously my instinctive answer to that is yes. Of course, there is an awful lot more than technology, and I think the most important, and perhaps I haven't and I should have mentioned, the most critical point is that communication is not really about technology. It's about us, about the usage and what we do with that technology. And therefore, I think that it's us as the users, our education of what technology can do, will make us better informed and therefore in a better position to influence the policymakers. So yes, that there is an awful lot more than meets the eye.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, a very broad question, but really well answered, actually. And I think, you know, it is a big wide world out there in terms of connectivity itself.
Correct.
So yeah, you managed to answer that really well. So Andrew, we've got a question in for you now. You mentioned dynamic system, which lets users know which frequencies are available. How many people have used this sort of system so far?
It's in the early days, actually, because we've got equipment which we can now buy and use legally in the UK. That's come from the US mainly. US and Canada are key suppliers there. The databases aren't typically things that users or humans would consult directly, but these radios will talk to the databases and would talk to the databases many, many times a day. For example, every 15 minutes is a typical stipulated time. But databases don't care. For example, Nominet runs an internet naming database, which is consulted presumably billions of times a day. You can't really do that with a spectrum regulator that's a human sitting at a desk with a telephone. It's not fast enough. Thanks,
Andrew. So is this just in the UK, or is this kind of a global concept in itself?
This is a global concept. Spectrum doesn't actually respect national borders. It travels radio waves come at us from all directions. And the value is, if it is worldwide, then we can have technology that scales to bring affordable power to our pocket for everyone. So I was actually going to show a couple more slides. One of them is really concerned with the fact that half of the world's population don't have connectivity yet. And in order to get them connectivity, we have to get the cost of connecting down to a few dollars a month. And it's not just for people in rural areas in Africa, for example. It's also the sensors that we want to have around our environment. Basically, a temperature sensor isn't worth more than a few dollars a month. Is even quite a lot to pay for connectivity for a little temperature sensor. So we need to have ways of scaling the connectivity costs, and being worldwide definitely helps that. Wi-Fi is a great example, as is Bluetooth. They're both worldwide standards.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I've got a question myself, actually, for you both. So I'm completely new to this whole topic. So I was just really intrigued how you both came into it. For anyone else that would be interested in getting involved, I mean, did you come at it through sort of, you know, a university level, or were you interested in it from the start, or how did you get involved and interested in this topic in itself?
Okay. Do you want me to go first, Anna?
Yes, please, Andrew. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I studied physics at university because I was really interested in how things work, and fascinated with the stars and cosmology and astronomy. All of the rules that underpin the world as we see it, and things we're discovering about it. So that went through BBC. I joined the BBC from university, having studied physics, and they're great at turning physicists into engineers. So I then learned about how you actually do broadcasting and make programs. And since then, I've worked with consultancies, helping operators and technology companies. And my own company, Larkhill, is a consultancy that helps people think about strategy. And through working closely with Microsoft, we've become aware of the needs of this area we call affordable connectivity. So this is, how do we get the price of connectivity down to the few dollars a month, if that's what it takes, using capacity which is unused. That's very exciting. If we can transform lives, as we can see happening in places like the Isle of Arran in Scotland with Arran Broadband, That's really exciting, as it is for villages in rural Kenya and South Africa, where I was recently talking with a group. Hope that helps. And Anna, sorry.
Yeah, well, I came to it more from the financial angle. I'm a qualified auditor, an accountant, but and I've got a mind for mathematics, but I tend to think of the whole world as mathematics, and the network industry particularly interests me because they affect so many parts of our life, so many aspects of our lives. I quickly realized that financial accounts or any financial reporting is actually possibly largely meaningless unless you understand the industry that lies behind it and the complexities. And I started in cable industries, and I now my interest also expands to space. And I think I was speaking to someone recently who said that once you're in communications, once you're in spectrum area, it's a little bit like a drug. You get hooked and you just want to know more and more. So I'm very pleased that I've entered that industry, and it's been a fascinating industry to have worked for the last 20 years plus of mine. And I'm sure it's got a very, very exciting future in front of it.
Yeah. And I think just coming very briefly, Emily, there we can see connectivity being embedded into so many different domains now. Whether it was, I was at a construction industry event yesterday, and the whole issue of how we have smart buildings, how we make better use of energy, how we monitor people's health in the future. All of those things are underpinned by connectivity. So I think it's a really exciting field for people to get into and get a grip on.
Thank you both. That was really interesting, and you're obviously both really passionate about this field. So it's great to get a bit of context first of all, then hear about how you made your way into it in the first place. I'm just gonna let you guys know that I'm gonna put the links to both of Andrew and Anna's companies into the session page. So if you want to find out more about what they do or the companies themselves, then take a look in the comments, just underneath the comments box on the session page, and you'll be able to find out more. But I think that's quite a good way to wrap up the session on those final words from Andrew. So I'd like to thank you both. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Anna, for joining us. And thank you to the online audience for your questions. Please do keep the conversation going. If you're interested in this field, you can keep commenting in the box below, and Andrew and Anna will pick up your questions afterwards. I'd also really like to recommend a session that's coming up next at the DIF. We are midway through and there's lots more coming up, but a fascinating session at 1 p.m. today is Kate Rayworth, How to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. Kate will be in the live studio with us, and it's going to be a fascinating session. So please do tune in around 20 minutes time. That will be kicking off. So thank you, Anna, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all those online. And we'll see you very soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.